and gentlemen, please put your hands together to welcome Dr. Aasim Husain for his presentation titled as Pakistan's Economic Growth Drivers and Constraints.
Thank you very much to the PBA for inviting me, and it is indeed an honor to participate and to present before this audience. My talk today is going to focus on the reasons for Pakistan's dramatic underperformance, Pakistan economy's dramatic underperformance. And I'm going to also then talk about how that can be fixed going forward. In outlining how the Pakistan economy fell behind over the last 5 decades, I will highlight in particular the role of rapid population growth, as mentioned by the minister towards the end of his presentation, and of economic policy mismanagement. I'm going to connect that to the principal, what I see as the principal macroeconomic challenges the country is facing now, namely the massive public interest bill and the wall of external debt repayments that the country must face year after year for the foreseeable future. I will then turn to how adopting an IMF-supported program has helped stabilize the economy, but I will talk also, or I will try to identify some of the risks and pressure points going forward under that program. And I'm going to then, after having put forward a number of criticisms, try to come up with a sort of a positive ending to the presentation to discuss what I think might be a better way forward, one that I think is feasible, and try and outline what would need to be done to change or reverse the economic underperformance that we have had. Okay. So I think this slide in a nutshell captures the economic underperformance. On the left is the picture how it was in the early 1970s, and what's graphed here is gross national income per capita. Pakistan, as you will see, back then, 50 years ago, a little over 50 years ago, was the highest among its neighbors. 50 years later, we are the lowest, and it's not by small amounts. So 50 years ago, we were almost twice or 1.5 times India and Bangladesh, higher than Sri Lanka, only by a little. And now we are about half the average of the other three. This is what I consider dismal. The same picture against the average of the other three. It's not a short-term decline. It is a pretty steady decline over the past 50 years. Population growth, or very rapid population growth, was a major factor underlying this relative underperformance. So what you see in this graph is how Pakistan's population has increased over the 50 years. Today we are 4 times what we were 50 years ago. The other countries, less than 3, 2.5 in fact, or even less than 2. Now, obviously, when you look at GDP or GNI per capita, this is the denominator, and having a faster or a larger denominator mathematically or arithmetically translates into underperformance. But that's not it. There is a feedback effect, and I'm going to come back to that, and I think it's actually very important. Okay, now, the underperformance was not limited only to economic aspects, but to socioeconomic aspects as well. So for example, health. And in this slide, I have life expectancy. Pakistan ranked in the, was the second highest 50 years ago. Today, we are the lowest. Not only has the progress been the least, but the relative position has deteriorated. This is one aspect of health. Another, stunting. Many people have seen various aspects of stunting. People have talked about it a lot. I think this graphically shows how bad the situation is in Pakistan. We rank worst today in terms of the prevalence of stunting among even our neighbors. Aside from health, education attainment indicators Pakistan's performance has also been horrible, again, relative to our neighbors. The difference here is even in 1970, we were at the bottom compared to our neighbors. And our progress has been the least, so we not only remain at the bottom, but the gap has widened. And this is true whether we consider secondary school enrollment or tertiary, and it's true for other indicators of enrollment. So the bottom line, Pakistan has failed to educate its citizens, particularly the underprivileged. Now, inadequate investment was a key factor determining this unimpressive economic growth. Investment, whether measured in terms of human capital, which we see in these education indicators, or in terms of fixed capital, which we see here, Pakistan compared to neighbors. Our investment rate has been much, much lower, sustained over the last 5 decades than the neighbors, especially the last 2 or 3 decades. And it has also been trending downward. No surprise then that economic growth has also been weaker. Now, one key factor limiting investment was saving. You can have foreign investment and you can have borrowing from abroad, but together, if you're doing well, if you're a country that is seen as a highly attractive location for foreign investors, you get maybe 2-3% of GDP a year consistently. If you are able to borrow abroad, you can borrow 2 or 3% of GDP a year comfortably if you have very solid fundamentals and so on. So together, this foreign saving, if you will, or foreign investment, if you will account for 4, 5, 6% of GDP. But we need investment. Our neighbors have investment in the 20 to 30% range. We need saving to be in that range as well. So foreign borrowing and foreign investment is not going to bring us even close to that. It will have to come mostly from domestic investment. Domestic investment, of course, then relies also on domestic saving. And the picture on the saving side is even worse than on the investment side. So Pakistan's trend saving rate has been downward since the early 1990s. The gap between Pakistan's savings rate between 5 and 10% and that of our neighbors between 20, 25, 30% is massive. Now, that begs the question, in my view, why is Pakistan's saving so meager? Now, many factors, of course, explain a country's saving rate. Its wealth, the growth rate of its income, structural factors such as financial deepening, which bankers here will be very familiar with. But a key variable in studies of saving behavior across countries is population growth. And actually, the working age population ratio, I think Dr. Salman had a graph on that in his slides. So here's the picture of Pakistan versus our neighbors. And the reverse of this is the dependent population ratio. So this shows what percent of the population is of working age, between the ages of 15 and 64. Pakistan's young population is much, much higher. In other words, those who are not yet of working age than our neighbors. Now, to understand the relationship between saving and population indicators like the working age population ratio, maybe a simple example helps. Imagine 2 families that are identical in all respects except one. So they have the same level of income, they have the same level of wealth, they live in similar houses, they live in, everything about them is the same except one family has 2 children, the other has 6. Imagine which family will be able to save more of its income. Clearly, the one with a higher working age ratio to its total population. The same applies at a macroeconomic country level. Pakistan's working age ratio is so low because of persistently high population growth. With a low working age population ratio, the ability to save is simply not there. With insufficient saving, it is very difficult to generate investment. Without investment, you don't get growth. So apart from the denominator effect that I had mentioned, the arithmetic effect, this is the other key factor in underlying the weak economic performance. Now with that, let me turn to the second part of what I said the story would be. How does this relate to the challenges that we are facing today? And there, the second aspect of the weak economic growth comes in, and that is economic policy mismanagement sustained over a long period. Consistently living beyond our means as far as the public spending is concerned has translated over time into large internal fiscal or external current account deficits that have persisted. So here I start with the fiscal deficit. As you will see, except for 1 year in our history, we have always run a deficit. This deficit over time has caused public debt to accumulate and has translated into a massive interest burden related to that debt. So much so that that interest burden is now, or actually this is before COVID, the last year before COVID, was among the highest in the world. In addition to this heavy interest burden, of course, the diversion of the limited amount of saving in the economy to financing the public sector deficit has meant crowding out of private investment. I will come back to that as well. But now, coming back to the public interest bill, already before COVID, we had one of the highest rates of interest to the government's revenue, 40%. In other words, almost half of what the government was taking in was going to service debt for past spending, leaving very little for current spending. The others with ratios similar to Pakistan's, Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Zambia, Ghana, and Egypt. And I mention these by name because 4 out of those 5 have undergone gut-wrenching debt restructuring. So being that high is a dangerous place. This was before COVID. This is the picture after COVID. Amazingly, Pakistan's interest to revenue, fiscal revenue ratio was 60% almost for 2 years running, the last 2 years running. This is clearly unsustainable. And Pakistan ranks among the highest in this. So this is 60 plus emerging market countries. And I'm not sure if those names are readable, especially from the back, but it's every large emerging market economy that you can imagine. The only ones excluded are small island countries or other tiny economies. Pakistan was the second highest. We cannot sustain having more than half our revenue going to service past spending. It's just not socially sustainable. Now, this was the fiscal side. The other macroeconomic imbalance was the external. A preference to keep the rupee overvalued, which keeps imports cheap, was historically sustained by borrowing foreign exchange. The problem with that strategy is whenever there's a shock, whether it's to world oil prices, whether it's because aid flows decline because of geopolitics or other reasons, or geopolitics in other countries, as now, or access to to international financing, it suddenly tightens. Whenever there's a shock, a major external crisis erupts. Now, in the latest episode, the story was magnified. Remember, it was in the context of COVID. Pakistan had widened its fiscal deficit to try and deal with COVID, but then the financing need also expanded. In addition, massive subsidized credit schemes were launched, which gave the private sector the resources to go out and buy foreign exchange, and with that foreign exchange, import massively. So there was a huge import spike and a large widening of the current account. So with that large run-up in the external deficit, the shocks happened. Russia-Ukraine war was launched. Commodity prices, especially of oil, skyrocketed. The temporary financing that had been provided by the IMF through its rapid financing instrument and through a new SDR allocation, the suspension of debt service by the G20 countries called the DSSI initiative, all those stopped. As a result, the ability to stay current with external obligations became very much in focus. So Pakistan was facing a $30 billion gross financing need, been in the range of 25 to 30 for the next 5, but 30 for the coming year. Reserves were well below that. Just external debt repayments at the time were 15 to 20 billion a year for the next 5. Things looked quite scary. In response, corrective policies were adopted: import restrictions, devaluation, the cessation of credit schemes, elimination of the petroleum subsidy, adjustment of electricity prices, all very painful measures, but at that point, no choice. It was either that or default. All this led to a jump in the price level, which at least initially also translated into a very rapid rise in inflation to levels that in my lifetime I don't remember, at least in my recent lifetime I don't remember. Since then, things have stabilized. The base effect of these adjustments has washed through. Internationally, oil prices, commodity prices have come down, so the pressure on inflation has unwound. It has also reduced the pressure on the exchange rate. In addition, the IMF program, or the IMF-supported program, has been adopted, which aims to address the fiscal imbalance by reducing the need to borrow. In particular, it aims to reduce the budget deficit by 3 percentage points of GDP in 3 years, and it will come all from tax revenue increases. The wall of external debt repayments that we're facing has also been addressed by promises from most of our, at least all of our, bilateral and multilateral creditors to continue to roll over Pakistan's maturing debt. So with that, let me talk about what I see as the pressure points in the program that the government has adopted. The tax to GDP ratio, as I mentioned, is to increase by 3 percentage points over 3 years. This slide shows how Pakistan stands relative to all emerging market countries. So as you will see, Pakistan in green has among the lowest revenue to GDP ratios among all emerging market countries. The red line is the 10th percentile. So the bottom 6 are at the red line. We're worse than the bottom 6. We simply don't collect revenue. So I think moving up by 3 percentage points of GDP is not only feasible, but it is necessary. But doing 2/3 of that, in other words, 2 percentage points in 1 year, strikes me as unrealistic. Setting a target that you will miss not only is embarrassing, but it also undermines credibility. So I think the ambition, the speed is too ambitious. On the other side, Pakistan aims to control primary spending. This is spending excluding interest. The idea is to keep interest at a level of 13.5% of GDP over the next 3 to 5 years. The problem with that strategy, as I see it, is Pakistan is already at a level among the lowest of all emerging market countries. I showed you at the beginning our lack of progress on economic and social indicators, especially health and education. with the same level of spending, it doesn't strike me as feasible to be able to make any progress on the social side. We will need to increase spending, but to do that, we will need more revenue. So how does this get squared? I just argued that the revenue target may be overambitious, at least in the very near term. And then I'm saying public spending, keeping it at that level is insufficient. It seems that there's a major tension here. And so it is basically with that thought in mind that many have suggested that perhaps debt restructuring needs to be considered. So the question is defaulting and restructuring our debt a viable and better alternative? And my answer to that is no. No, because it would put the economy in a worse crisis than it just underwent 2 years ago. And the reason is because of the composition of Pakistan's debt. Now, the bulk of our external debt, 85% in fact, is concessional. It is concessional, and it is to multilateral and bilateral creditors who have already agreed under the program adopted to roll over this debt. So at least for the time being, as long as the program remains in place, the risk associated with having to repay it all at once is not there. Because it is concessional, also the burden associated with it is minimal, or at least not as severe. Only about 12-13% of all the interest paid by the government last year was to external creditors. That implies an average interest rate of less than 3%. Restructuring this debt is basically shooting yourself in the foot. And the gains from it in terms of interest or repayment is minimal. Now, what about restructuring domestic debt? Mind you, very few countries actually do it because of the political problems that generates. But even there, the debt structure is important. The fact is, and I think you will all know this better than me, more than half, 60% of Pakistan government domestic debt is held by the banking sector. And it in turn accounts for more than half of banking sector's balance sheet. If you restructure it, even a small haircut is going to wipe out the aggregate capital of the whole banking sector, even a small haircut. So, and remember, a small haircut only gives you a small gain. And once you wipe out all the capital base of the banking system, who's next? Depositors. If you touch depositors, the disruption to the financial system is huge, and the social dislocation is huge. So unless there is really no other choice, this is not a route that one goes down, and that is why we don't see it internationally. So back to the revenue slide, is there a better way? Is there an alternative? And I argue there is. On the revenue side, I don't think there is any escaping the need to dramatically increase revenue. I think having a goal of reaching the 25th percentile of emerging markets, remember that is the bottom quarter, but reaching just the bottom quarter should be feasible over 5 to 6 years. That implies 1 percentage point of GDP a year. Not 2, just 1. But even that is not easy, but it has to be done. There's no other way. We cannot continue to live as the worst country in terms of being able to generate tax revenue, in not just a neighborhood, in the whole world. At the 25th percentile, mind you, are countries like Kenya, Egypt, Nepal. So these are not, I don't think at least, countries with massively better institutions than ours. If they can do it, and remember, they're at the 25th percentile, there is no reason why it cannot be accomplished in Pakistan, at least over that horizon. So I just spoke about the revenue side. I'd like to just say a few words on the spending side. With the increase in revenue, I think half of it should be used to unlock spending. Of course, when I say that we need to increase spending, I don't mean to suggest that the quality of spending at present is satisfactory. There needs to be a clear reallocation of spending to more efficient and better ends. But together with a reallocation, some increase in the level of spending, half of what we gain from revenue, would allow us to reach the bottom quarter of emerging market countries. That too, again, some comparators, Kenya, Tanzania, Cambodia, not necessarily big spenders, not necessarily countries free of corruption or other issues, but they have managed to reach that level. I think it's a useful goal for us to have. Of course, to support that, structural reform will be needed. I don't have time to go into the aspects of it, but let me just mention those. I think the minister talked about all of these. Expanding the tax base, first and foremost, addressing cost inefficiencies in the power sector to allow for downward tariff adjustments, addressing the quality as well as the scale of social spending, possibly delegating spending responsibilities even more to the provincial level, which in turn would also address the federal-provincial imbalance in resources, privatizing state enterprises to relieve pressure on the budget and also to improve service delivery. All that, I think, is necessary, but there will still be a problem. Having a somewhat looser fiscal stance than what is envisaged under the IMF program will require more financing. Financing from the market is expensive, whether international or domestic, and if you do from the domestic, that means more crowding out of private investment. So, hopefully, we will be able to mobilize more concessional financing in the near term from external creditors, multilateral and bilateral, and in doing so, relieve some of the burden for domestic private investment. Capital formation needs to be much higher. Investment needs to be much higher than it is now. So getting 2 or 3% more from concessional financing will not do the trick. We need to increase investment by 10, 15, 20 percentage points. For that, we will need to increase saving. To increase saving, what must we do? Here, I think the example of Bangladesh is a useful one. Bangladesh is the blue line. Look at the increase in saving and the steady increase in saving over time. This comes, interestingly, I think, from very successful family planning campaigns. But in addition, there was a huge focus on education, especially for women. In addition, the Grameen Bank and other microfinance institutions lent only exclusively or almost exclusively to women, elevating their position in their households, empowering them with childbearing decisions much more than otherwise. Likewise, the garment sector employed almost exclusively women, effectively giving them the same power as microfinance institutions, something perhaps can be considered or thought about and applied to the Pakistani context, again, from a socioeconomic background not too different from our own. So let me close by saying we have to bring down population growth. The way to do it, I don't know, but success there, and the other countries' experience has shown it, has been significant. Bangladesh, India, even Sri Lanka earlier on achieved very large increases in their working age population ratios in as little as a decade. There's no reason why we cannot aspire to do the same. If we do that, our savings rate can be markedly increased, in turn unlocking funds for investment. With that, significant change in the relative economic performance can be realized. Thank you.